The term cold case refers to an investigation that either lacked evidence or came to a dead end and was put away for a long period of time. Some cold cases date back to the early 1900s, and thankfully, with technology advancing every day and former witnesses finally coming forward after years of silence, some cold cases are lucky enough to be solved. Whether it's just after 5 years or several decades, a breakthrough in a cold case can provide long-awaited answers to family members of victims and a new direction for investigators interested in the case. Number 5. In 1993, a 19-year-old man named Frank McAllister was reported missing. His then-girlfriend had not heard from Frank in several days, and after checking his home and workplace, decided the situation was serious enough for the police to get involved. A search for the young man lasted several months before investigators ended the search due to a lack of evidence or any new leads. The following year, Frank's remains were discovered by a hiker in Shingletown, California. The investigation sparked again as officers searched for a killer. Unfortunately, they reached yet another dead end and were forced to label the case as cold, meaning the ongoing investigation would stop indefinitely. Despite locating the remains of the missing man, the case eventually went cold and untouched for decades. However, in January of 2018, 25 years after the murder, 44-year-old Brian Keith Hawkins called a local TV news station in his area to confess to the crime. He stated that he could no longer deal with the guilt he felt over his involvement in the crime. The station's producers immediately took the confession very seriously and briefly interviewed Hawkins. He made a statement with the station which was shared with the Reading police. A few days later, Hawkins agreed to meet with officers to turn himself in and provided more information about the case. Hawkins led officers to 2 other suspects that were allegedly involved in the murder. Reading police arrested all 3 just a few days after the initial confession, and a trial was set to begin soon after, in which evidence would be re-examined with new information. Number 4. "12-year-old Michelle Welch was living in Tacoma, Washington when she mysteriously vanished on March 26, 1986. Michelle had gone to a park a few blocks from her home with 2 of her younger sisters. The siblings arrived at the park at 10 a.m. and spent an hour playing and exploring. Around 11 a.m., Michelle rode her bike back home, leaving her sisters at the park to pack lunches. When she returned to the park, she chained her bike beside her sisters, sat their lunch on a table nearby, and went searching for her siblings. The 2 younger girls had walked to a nearby business to use the bathroom, but Michelle was obviously unaware of that at the time and spent time searching the park and nearby forest areas for the sisters. The younger girls arrived back at the park about 2 hours later and found their packed lunches sitting on the table. However, they couldn't locate Michelle. The girls searched for a short time but eventually returned to their day of play. Eventually, the girls searched a bit more before they were told to come back home by their babysitter. After the girls returned home and explained what happened to Michelle, the babysitter realized something was very wrong and called the girls' parents as well as local authorities. Around 3 p.m. that day, officers and family members arrived at the park to find the young girl. The search carried on tirelessly for several hours until a search dog finally located Michelle's remains at around 11:30 p.m. According to the case details available online, she was found in a makeshift fire pit area in a gulch. She'd been beaten and sexually assaulted and died from a cut to her neck. During the following investigation, a classmate came forward to report that they'd seen a man walking toward the area where Michelle was found. Unfortunately, this witness lacked crucial details to accurately describe the unknown man, and a suspect was never apprehended. A few months after Michelle's death, Tacoma police were informed of a similar murder. Jennifer Bastian was close to Michelle in age, and circumstances of her death were eerily similar, leading investigators to believe that this could have been the work of a serial killer, or at least a registered sex offender with a lengthy criminal past. However, it was revealed in 2015 after new testing that the same person did not commit both crimes. Despite over 10,000 hours of investigative work being poured into the case in 1986, it was eventually set aside and went cold. In 2016, investigators submitted the found DNA to a database, which would predict the physical description of the suspect. After a general description was provided, the Tacoma Police Department activated its child abduction response team and treated the case as if it were brand new. While this was great news for the case, the major breakthrough didn't occur until early 2018. Officers submitted the DNA sample for genealogy testing, and those results combined with the physical description of the suspect helped investigators create a family tree which led them directly to a suspect. They tracked down Gary Hartman and followed him into a restaurant one day. Officers collected DNA off of a used napkin that he left behind, and the results showed that Gary's DNA matched the samples from the scene of the crime. Oddly enough, Gary had a clean criminal record and was working as a nurse at a local hospital. The 66-year-old suspect was charged for murder and rape. Number 3. April Tinsley was an 8-year-old girl from Fort Wayne, Indiana that was abducted in 1988. April was outside playing with friends before she went missing on April 1st, 1988. The children were moving between houses and playing in the streets of their quiet suburban neighborhood like it was any other day. Many of the children had returned home, but April had forgotten her umbrella at a friend's house. According to the friend's mother, April grabbed her umbrella and left, heading in the direction of her home. However, she was never seen again. April's mother was concerned when her daughter didn't return home for dinner that night, and searched briefly throughout the neighborhood but eventually decided to call police. Although her call occurred in the late evening, investigators concluded that the child disappeared at around 3 p.m. earlier that day. A massive search party of over 300 officers and countless residents of the neighborhood looked everywhere for April. The search continued until a jogger found April's remains on April 4th. She was found in a ditch along the road around 30 minutes from her hometown. One of her shoes and an erotic toy in a plastic bag was found nearby her body. An autopsy report showed that April was assaulted and strangled. It was provided that she'd been deceased for at least 1 or 2 days before she was discovered. The following investigation caused several witnesses to call in and report information. One witness claimed that they saw a white man in his 30s forcing April into the back of his pickup truck one day when she disappeared. Another report described a similar male in a blue pickup truck near the site where April's remains were found. Despite these details, officers were unable to locate the suspect or any further evidence that could have helped the case. At first, it was believed that April's case was connected to a similar case of a child that was murdered in the same state. The circumstances of the crimes were similar but not exactly the same. After an in-depth analysis, it was determined that the two cases were unrelated, and investigators once again hit a dead end. In 1990, a message was written across a barn door in crayon. The message read, "I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find the other shoe? Haha, I will kill again." Although evidence and DNA samples were collected from this scene, it didn't help lead officers to a suspect. In 2004, decades after the case had gone cold, the killer left taunting letters for investigators. The notes mentioned the case, featured photos of the killer from the waist down, and used condoms. The notes were left on the front doors of homes where young girls lived. The DNA from the condoms matched the DNA collected from the scene, but investigators were still unable to locate a suspect. In 2015, popular new technology was used to create a physical description of the suspect, and in January of 2018, a new law required criminals convicted of felony charges to submit DNA samples to be entered into a nationwide database. The database found a match for April's case and led officers to their suspect. Cops arrived at John Miller's home, and when asked if he knew why they were there, he responded, "April Tinsley." Number 2. Instead of focusing on a single victim, this cold case breakthrough is about a killer with many victims. Additionally, this case is different because it doesn't rely on new technology being used on old DNA samples. Instead, this breakthrough is the result of Samuel Little coming forward to confess his heinous crimes. In 1984, Little met 21-year-old Mary Jo Payton at a bar. They talked for some time and eventually left the bar together. Little drove Mary to an abandoned factory where he then strangled her. He disposed of her remains in a basement stairwell, and she was later found by employees of a nearby company. In August of 1991, Little met 32-year-old Rose Evans, whom he later strangled in his car and dumped in a vacant lot. Rose was discovered by a pedestrian. Both cases were investigated, but officers failed to discover any substantial evidence that would help them identify a killer. As a result, the cases eventually went cold and stayed that way for decades. In 2012, Little was arrested for narcotics charges. While imprisoned, Little was required by Los Angeles police to provide a DNA sample for his suspected involvement in unsolved murder cases. The samples were a match, and Little was convicted of 3 murder charges, for which he was handed 3 life sentences. Little confessed to murdering up to 93 women as part of a plea deal, and investigators and prosecutors immediately went to work to confirm Little's connection to the endless series of crimes. Little sat down with the team and explained the details and locations of every murder that he could remember. He also provided 16 sketches of victims to help officers locate possible unsolved missing persons or murder cases. The sketches were released to the public as a call for action for anyone who may have information. Although more than half of Little's crimes are successfully confirmed in connection to him, officers are still trying to confirm others. Seeing as most of these charges will ultimately result in the 78-year-old killer spending the rest of his life behind bars, it's almost strange that he confessed to all of these crimes. Some speculate that the guilt finally caught up with him. Others think that someone who is able to kill 93 people probably just doesn't feel any remorse. But regardless of his motive, his confessions have led to justice being served and the victims' loved ones finally getting answers to questions that haunted them for decades. Number 1. The most disturbing murder cases are the ones in which the victim was just living their daily life completely unaware of their fate. In 1998, 18-year-old Miranda Fenner was blissfully unaware that she would be killed while working an evening shift at a video rental store in her hometown. Around 8:15 p.m. during her shift, a passing motorist noticed a young woman trying to crawl out of the video store. The witness approached the victim, who was later confirmed to be Miranda, and noticed blood spilling out. The witness called 911 and emergency responders arrived within minutes. Miranda had been stabbed multiple times in her neck and head and was rushed to a hospital. She was treated for her wounds but ultimately did not survive. She passed away about 2 hours later. The investigation was on and officers focused on obtaining as much information as possible. 700 interviews were conducted over the course of the investigation, but the efforts proved to be useless as investigators continuously hit dead ends. A small amount of cash had been stolen from the video store, which suggested that the crime was a robbery gone wrong. However, other details combined with Miranda's wounds proved that the murder was more than just about a few dollars in cash. As you may expect, the case was pushed aside and went cold. Over the following years, efforts were made to reopen the case, and DNA samples were submitted by a variety of databases and testing centers, but to no avail. Finally though, in 2017, 19 years after the crime, a suspect was apprehended. Zachary David O'Neill was being interrogated by Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office for rape and attempted murder. After hours of interviewing, O'Neill finally confessed to the crime. Additionally, he confessed that he was the killer in Miranda's case though. His statement provided specific details that proved that this was true. DNA samples were also compared and confirmed that he was a match. Much to the surprise of investigators and family members, O'Neill explained that he was attempting to rob the video store when Miranda put up a fight, which led to him killing her. This is yet another case in which the case was solely solved based on the criminal confession. Obviously, Miranda's loved ones were happy to see her killer finally facing justice. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep updated with our videos. And if you enjoyed this narration, maybe consider checking out my personal channel at youtube.com/ty_knots.